So, welcome to chapter 4. And I was in the middle of explaining something of the events of the time when Margaret Thatcher was in office. Obviously, somebody who made a big effect both on the reality of people's lives and also on the image of Britain. Although the prime ministers just before her and just after her may have been forgotten. Certainly, Margaret Thatcher was not forgotten, and she is still referred to today. President Macron once mentioned that he would like to be the Margaret Thatcher of France, which just goes to show how much influence she had. And indeed, she set off the what has sometimes been called the neoliberal revolution. That may well be overstating the case, but certainly she made a series of radical changes which changed British society, and I've spoken about a few of them. In the 1980s, the following key moment, if you like, which I'd like to mention, is the miners' strike of 1984, or indeed from 1984 to 1985, because the strike actually lasted a year, and around 100,000 miners were on strike at the beginning, and most of them stayed on strike throughout the whole year. So you can imagine that this was an extremely difficult time for them, if you imagine a year without wages. And this was very much a key battle for Margaret Thatcher, because the miners' union was the most powerful union in the country. And so although the miners' strike was extremely expensive for the government, they had to import coal from Poland, and they paid very large numbers of hours of overtime to the police. It really was, from an economic point of view, it was extremely expensive. Nevertheless, from a political point of view, the aim was to defeat the miners and therefore demoralize and weaken all trade unions across Britain. This was something which Margaret Thatcher succeeded in doing. Of course, there was nothing, it was not inevitable that this should happen this way. There were a couple of points during the strike when the miners almost won, but in the end they were defeated. Indeed, the opposition to Margaret Thatcher appeared to be, for a few years, quite demoralized, and it seemed to be difficult to mobilize people against the priorities of the Thatcher government. But in 1990, that changed, because it may be that Margaret Thatcher became overconfident. In any case, she introduced a new reform of local taxes. Local taxes had always been paid in the way they are in most countries, like in France. If you live in a big house, you pay a lot, and if you live in a small flat, you only pay a small amount, relatively. And the new system which Margaret Thatcher brought in, called the community charge, said that every adult should pay the same tax, and that is to say that if there are 3 of you living in a studio, you pay 3 times £300 or whatever it is, and if there's 1 of you living in a big house, you pay £300 as well. This is a principle of taxation which is almost unknown in the democratic world, certainly in Japan, the United States, Germany, France, etc. Never been tried. So it may have been that she was overconfident. In any case, millions of people refused to pay. And here this becomes a great problem for government, because of course if 1,000 people refuse to pay, it's possible to use the courts to punish them in some way. But when it gets into the millions, it really can be very difficult. I remember my father was considering refusing to pay, and given that my father was perhaps the most conservative working class man in the Western Hemisphere, this was the moment when I thought this is the end for Thatcher. And indeed it was, although she made various concessions, like less payment if you were poor, it didn't go through, and when it wasn't accepted by people, and when another conflict came up about Europe, many Conservative MPs thought, after the poll tax, Margaret Thatcher will lose the next election, so we want somebody else. And I remember a couple of days before Margaret Thatcher resigned, she was in Paris, and she said, "I will never resign." and a couple of days later she resigned. This is not surprising, of course. If you're prime minister, you cannot go on television and say, I might resign, I might not resign, I haven't decided. It's political suicide. And so Margaret Thatcher was out. And the new prime minister was John Major, who certainly felt a lot less confident after Margaret Thatcher had been pushed out, and was much more reserved and hesitant about introducing new reforms. The next event I want to mention is in 1993, although its effects continued for 20 years or so afterwards. And this is the story of the murder of the young gentleman you can see here. This gentleman, Stephen, was waiting at a bus stop. He was killed by a group of racists. Now, this is rare in Britain, but it was not the first time, and it was very striking how Stephen Lawrence's name was, how in the 1970s, when a black person had been killed by racism, it was somewhere in the newspapers on page 7. Whereas in the 1990s, it seemed that people were, a much wider number of people were extremely angry by this. And I'm giving you an example here. Oh, the next thing that happened, which is horrific but interesting, is that in fact locally, many people knew who this gang of racists were. They were well known. However, the police, the local police, were not really interested, did not look very hard, and the result was that they didn't manage to make the charges stick. I won't go into the details, you can find the details somewhere. And one of the results is here. What you see is the front page of the Daily Mail, I think a few months later, perhaps even a year later, which gives the photographs of the 5 men, and it says, "Murderers, the Mail accuses these men of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us." Now, if you've ever had any contact with a newspaper, you know that printing on your first page, "so-and-so is a murderer," is extremely dangerous, because if you are accused by these people of libel, you can have to pay a huge amount of money. But what is surprising about this front page is not so much that, it is that this is the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is the most conservative of the popular newspapers. So this is not Socialist Worker or Libération putting your murderers on the front page. This is a very conservative newspaper. And it's a little symbol, although there was plenty of racism left in Britain in the 1990s. It was no longer, everyday racism was no longer at the level it had been in the 1970s. In the 1970s, a conservative paper would not dare put this kind of thing on their front page because they would be very frightened of losing readers. The results, it's rather a long story, but in any case, they got away initially, and of course you have a law in most countries. If you are accused of murder and there is a trial and you're found not guilty, there cannot be another trial. You cannot be tried twice for the same thing. But what happened here, in fact, is that a few years later, when the new government came in, they passed a law specially to say that in certain circumstances you can have a second trial if there is overwhelming new evidence. And using DNA, they were able to successfully try several of these people, but I think the last one is still in Spain somewhere. Indeed, in 1997, then after 18 years of Conservative government, the new Prime Minister was sworn in. However, the Labour Party had very much changed in that time, and the part of the Labour Party represented by Tony Blair considered that it was better to accept half of Margaret Thatcher's ideas and no longer defend the traditional values of the Labour movement. To such an extent that Tony Blair said, "We are changing the name of the party. We're going to call it New Labour." Now, if you saw the Pope on the television saying, "We're changing the name of the church, we're going to call it the New Catholic Church," you would be extremely surprised, because of course, if you decide we need the name New Labour, that means you're saying the old party was no good. and indeed New Labour and Tony Blair's government will no longer have a priority of encouraging trade unionism. They will no longer have a priority of nationalisation, and indeed the privatisation of different aspects of the economy will continue under Tony Blair, and also the rise of the cost, for example, of going to university, then an application of neoliberalism along the lines of the idea is if you go to university, you're going for you, so you should pay, a principle which we don't follow in France, in my view, fortunately. And this then the other enormous result of the Stephen Lawrence murder is that the new government asked for a report about racism. This was called the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry, and it was led by Lord Macpherson, so very much an establishment figure. And they looked at why the police were not interested in finding Stephen Lawrence's killers. And this report was a political earthquake because Lord Macpherson said the Metropolitan Police in London are, and I quote, institutionally racist. Now, if Socialist Worker or Militant had written the police are institutionally racist, nobody would be surprised. That's what left-wing papers say about the police. But in this case, this was an extremely establishment inquiry which came to this conclusion. Institutionally racist, that means it was not the case, they said. It was not the case that in the police there was a racist minority. They said, no, the structures of the police are racist. And understandably, the logical result of this was that very important reforms were required. And indeed, the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry made a long list of recommendations, which became the basis of the Act in 2000 in 2000 about what's it called, the Equality Act or the Racial Equality Act. I can't quite remember, but in any case, the Act of 2000. And let me explain a little bit of what this Act says, because it's very important. What it said is that every public body, university, local council, hospital, is obliged to promote racial equality. That means that this is a new way of looking at racism. Traditionally, before this, apart from slight exceptions in Australia and Canada, the two best known ways of dealing with racism were, one, the individual way, that is to say that if an individual black person went to work in a hospital and felt that they were not being promoted to manager because they were black, then they could go to a lawyer and go to a tribunal. And of course, the difficulty is it's extremely difficult to prove that the reason you were not promoted was because you were black. So that was the first best known method. The second best known method, which is well known in the United States, but which is unknown in the United Kingdom, which is never used in the United Kingdom, with a slight exception for Catholics in Northern Ireland, is the method of quotas, where, for example, in some universities in the south of the United States, they said, right, 10% of all professors must be black. The reason they did this is that they found themselves, as the civil rights movement finished, in a situation where you had universities in the south where 90% of the students were black and 100% of the teachers were white, and nothing appeared to be changing. So that was a particular response to quotas, which in general which has almost never been adopted in Britain. So this was a third approach that was coming in, partly inspired, as I say, by Australia and Canada. And this was that every public body has a responsibility to promote racial equality. Let me give you an example. A hospital in London with 1,000 workers in it in 1999. 1,000 workers and 100 managers, let's say, let's simplify it. Among the 1,000 workers, 700 are black. This is not surprising in hospitals in London. Among the 100 managers, only 5 are black. We're rather shocked, but it would not be that surprising in London at the time. And under the new law, this situation meant that the hospital was obliged to show it was taking action against this inequality. You have 70% of the workers who are black, only 5% of the managers are black. There's a problem, and the hospital must show in its annual report what it's doing about this problem. So, for example, one of the things they do is they say, okay, from now on, every recruitment committee for a manager will be half black. It doesn't matter if we don't have many black managers here. We will bring one in from Glasgow, one in from Manchester, one in from Birmingham. But we've decided every recruitment committee will be 50-50 black and white, because it is well known that committees tend to recruit people who resemble themselves, even when they're not intending to be racist or discriminatory in any other way. That's one example. Another example, they might have every year a special week's training reserved for black employees who want to become managers. Those are just two examples, but there are many, many dozens of different actions which are possible, but the duty of every public body is to promote racial equality, that is to say, to fight racial inequality. And this was a big, important change. The end, the beginning of Tony Blair's government was also was also marked by the referendums in Scotland and in Wales to decide on an autonomous parliament. An autonomous parliament, then this is not independence, but this is an autonomous parliament with a lot of power. The Scottish Parliament today decides on education, they decide on health, they decide on transport, they decide on tourism. They do not decide on the army and on finance, for example. Both Scotland and Wales decided, yes, they did want an autonomous parliament. In Scotland, there were actually two questions on the referendum. In Scotland, they decided they wanted an autonomous parliament with a lot of power, with the power to raise its own taxes. Whereas in Wales, they voted by a very small majority to have an autonomous assembly, but not so powerful. It's become more powerful since. So this idea of cracks opening up in the United Kingdom and the resulting effects on both politics and also on identity. That was a big, big event from 1997. The new Labour governments of Tony Blair, as I mentioned, were less left-wing and less interested in traditional socialist values. We'd had in 1945 the most left-wing Labour government, which introduced the free doctors and the free hospitals and set going the social housing programs. We'd had the Wilson governments of the 1960s, which did not spend so much money on social programs, but did make important reforms about contraception, abortion, homosexuality, censorship, and so on. And here we have the third big wave of reforms, which were more along the lines of democratic and constitutional reform, and less along the lines of social reforms, even though there was in 1998 the Minimum Wage Act. That is to say, before 1998, in most of the economy, there was no minimum wage in Britain. It was completely legal to pay somebody £1 an hour to clean hotels, and people did. And so the introduction of a minimum wage, even though it was rather low, was an important change. And there was also in 2000 a Freedom of Information Act along the American model, which gave an automatic right to the public to have information from the public sector, unless there was a very good reason for them not to have it. So, for example, if I looked at this hospital and I suspected that the management committee was racist, I can write to the hospital and say, I want a copy of the minutes of every central management committee this year. And they are obliged to send it to me. Yeah? And this is the Freedom of Information Act. So what changes? Also, this is the moment when the Supreme Court was established, and the House of Lords was radically changed after 1999. Only a small minority of the Lords sitting in the House of Lords are aristocrats. The rest of them have been nominated by the Prime Minister for services to the country. This is the law I was mentioning, which was the result of the Stephen Lawrence case and the Macpherson report. This is the Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000, and this gives the obligation for all public bodies, schools, universities, hospitals, councils, to promote racial equality, and this will later be matched by a duty to promote gender equality. The early 2000s was marked by this enormous war in Iraq, and although you can only see a very small part of the demonstration, this was the biggest demonstration for many decades in London against the war in Iraq. I'm moving a little more quickly than I did in the 50s and 60s because I suspected that the events from the 50s and 60s you had forgotten more than the more recent ones. In 2010, there is an important event which is related to the event which I mentioned in 1972, Bloody Sunday, where a series of young men were killed by the British Army. The government decided to have a second inquiry. Now, this wasn't easy because in 1972, the House of Commons had voted that there was no problem, that the army acted in self-defense, and the House of Lords had voted the same thing. And you're not usually allowed to open another inquiry when the problem has been solved, in inverted commas. But because of the negotiations in 1997, 1998 for the Good Friday Agreement, which suspended or really stopped for the time being the military conflict in Northern Ireland, a second inquiry into Bloody Sunday was obligatory. That is to say, the Republican negotiators, who were negotiating many, many different things, better treatment for Catholics in the North, more cooperation with the South, a very complicated political system in the Northern Ireland Parliament, where both Catholics and Protestants would always have a part of the power, whatever the election said. All these things they were negotiating, and the Republican negotiators said to the government, if there is not a second inquiry into Bloody Sunday, our people will not follow us, will not want a peace. Because they were thinking, the people were thinking, if the British Army can shoot our children in front of our houses and there is no truth or justice about this, then we don't want peace, because, you know, peace is only peace without justice is not really peace. And so there was a second inquiry into Bloody Sunday, which concluded that the British Army had no right to shoot, that the people killed were unarmed. And indeed, David Cameron officially apologized for Bloody Sunday in 2010. David Cameron, indeed, Prime Minister in 2010, 2016. Slightly different style. He didn't go around saying, we will continue the work of Margaret Thatcher or anything like that. They tended to play down Margaret Thatcher for a while. Nevertheless, continuing the neoliberal policies of privatizing pensions, having prisons run by private companies, and so on. Indeed, in every aspect of neoliberalism, Britain has gone further than France, with a couple of exceptions like the Free Doctors. And indeed, just after, when David Cameron, then a Conservative Prime Minister, came to office in 2010, and then so the Labour Party left office, in fact, the plans had already been made for the Olympic Games in 2012, and the opening ceremony. Now, the opening ceremony, I think it lasts 4 hours, and it's supposed to present Britain to the world. And it is an extremely impressive moment. I can't remember how many million viewers there were, but it was hundreds of millions of viewers around the world. And of course, it has to be very visual because it's all the people are all watching in different languages. And they decided to present a number of symbolic elements of Britain that British people might be proud of. So you see at the bottom, crickets, and at the top, nurses from the National Health Service. Also, British popular music was very, very present. The British are very proud of the popular music, and it's very successful for a small country in popular music. How many Portuguese groups can you name? So there you see Dizzy Rascal, the British rapper, as part of the opening ceremony, and also the opening ceremony wanted to include two things which the British are extremely famous for. First of all, the royal family, and secondly, British humour. I don't know what British humour is. I don't know if it's really different from anybody else's, but I suspect that the real difference is that in Britain, humour is obligatory almost all the time. So how do they integrate these two elements? Well, there was lots of humour in other parts of the ceremony, but here you can see the Queen of England arriving at the Olympic Stadium in a parachute. Now, of course, you can imagine it's not the real Queen. However, the real Queen was part of the film and was shown at the very beginning, meeting James Bond and shaking his hand and walking out towards the helicopter. She was then replaced by somebody, I hope, younger, to pretend to parachute into the stadium. Two other tremendously important moments I want to mention. First is that in 2014, for the first time, there was a referendum in Scotland to decide whether Scotland should be independent or not. The results was, I think it's 55% approximately, for staying in the United Kingdom and 45% or so for independence. Now, this appears to be, from one point of view, a defeat for the nationalists, but not really. There were, for many, many years in the 50s and 60s and 70s, 5–10% of the population wanted independence. And so to bring the vote up to 45% in some ways was a victory. And certainly during the debate on the referendum, the Scottish nationalists managed to persuade millions of people that independence was possible. Whereas previously a lot of people, oh, so it's too small a country, it's not really possible. And the nationalists during the referendum campaign gave a lot of detailed information about other small countries like Denmark, and attempted to demonstrate that it was perfectly possible for Scotland to be independent. The British government in London became quite worried. Indeed, at one point, they closed down Parliament for a day, and the three leaders of the Labour Party, the Conservative Party in government, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and the Labour Party, all went to Scotland together and signed this promise about a better deal for Scotland if they don't vote for independence. So you can see they were pretty worried, and so extremely relieved when independence did not win the referendum. This is not the end of this story. Now, and in particular, because of the case of the fact that Britain has left the European Union, there are a number of people pushing for a second referendum. This is a difficult one for the Scottish National Party, who also, remember, have the majority in Edinburgh in the autonomous parliament. It's difficult because, of course, if you're going to win, that's good. But it's a big risk, because if you lose two independence referendums, that's sounding like you're not going to get another chance for a whole generation. And so the leadership of the Scottish National Party, although in theory they're in favour of a second referendum, they're not always so enthusiastic about making it happen. And 2016, of course, a change which you have all heard quite a lot about, and that is the decision by referendum, by the biggest votes, I think, ever in a referendum in Britain. 17 million people said we want to leave the European Union, and 15 and a bit million said we want to stay in the European Union, and therefore Britain has now left the European Union, although the details have not been negotiated. They're being negotiated at the moment. Now, here you have a German newspaper, ouch, and a conservative newspaper in Britain were out. After 43 years, UK freed from the shackles of the European Union, the shackles, the chains. Now, the reasons for the no vote are quite complex. Cameron was sure that the yes vote would, that the Remain vote would win. That's why he organized the referendum. He thought, oh, the Remain vote will win, and in that way, those people in my party who don't like the European Union will shut up for a while. But between those people who found that over 40 years, the ordinary British people had not benefited very much from the membership of the European Union, and those people who didn't like the European Union's policies on pushing privatization, and those people who didn't like the democratic structures of the European Parliament, finding that they were not democratic enough, and those people who felt that the European Union membership meant that a lot of Romanian and Eastern European migrants were coming to Britain, and these people not wanting that to happen. So you had an extremely mixed group of people who had in common dislike for the European Union. And they used to see some of the posters that were used. On the left, then, you have posters for Brexit, keep calm about the breakfast, or no to the European Union, yes to the wider world. And on the right, you have one of the posters of the Remain campaign. For 60 years, the EU has been the foundation of peace between European neighbours after centuries of bloodshed. So there you go. Cameron, of course, had to resign because he lost the referendum and was replaced by somebody who was not very well known, Theresa May, who tried to find an agreement with the European Union and was not successful, replaced by Boris Johnson, who found an agreement, but which is a little bit shaky, as we are seeing these last few weeks. It's a little bit more than a little bit shaky, I'm being English about this, in that in the agreement, a very large number of questions are left until later. And the question of the border in Northern Ireland, the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, is solved by ambiguous wording. Of course, ambiguous wording comes back to haunt you. And indeed, let me just have a look at this. This is the terrible paradox of the negotiations. Yeah, that because of the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the military conflict in 1998, and because the Republicans in Northern Ireland really don't want to see a hard border in the middle of Ireland, which is seen as their country, and because the Unionists in the north, who want to stay close to England, refuse to have a real border between Northern Ireland and England, the problem seems extremely difficult to solve, and at the moment we don't know what's going to happen, and this is one big crisis which we're going to see over the next few months. Last event I want to mention, the election in, I think it's 2017 or 2015. A few years ago, the election to the head of the Labour Party of a very left-wing leader. Probably to be compared with somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, who had a successful election in 2017. I'm mixing up the dates here, but anyway, who had a first successful election and a successful re-election for him as the leader of the Labour Party, but then who lost the elections in 2019 and resigned and has been replaced by Keir Starmer, who is absolutely not a left-wing, a part of the left wing of Labour. So that's something which is all still going on. So I brought us rather quickly up to date because I don't want to spend many classes talking about the general background. And in the next chapter, I'm going to turn on to popular culture, what is it, how does it work, how can we study it? Okay, and so that's the end for today. That was the end of chapter number 4.